Hello, I'm Jo Walton. So in this session we're going to continue the focus on tools and resources, and what we'll soon be wanting to ask you is what else is already out there? We know that there's a lot of expertise here today, so we'd really like to crowdsource your suggestions, resources, formats, tips, tricks, just really great examples of climate risk communication when it's done well. And also, what isn't out there? What are the biggest challenges and frustrations that you face? And what tools can you perhaps imagine to support you? So perhaps you can start thinking about that. But for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk a little bit about visualizing climate risk. And this draws a bit on these two recent open publications, Visualizing Uncertainty, a Short Introduction, that's from our network, and Data Visualization in Society. So you live in Florida. Specifically, you live in Jacksonville, there in the sort of northeast corner. And you've just been shown this diagram. Two questions. First, how do you interpret this? What information is it communicating? And second, could you see it other ways? Can you see any ways that it might be misinterpreted, perhaps? And I'll actually give you a second to think about this. So, how do you interpret this? But how might someone else perhaps interpret it differently? And a bonus question, how many ways can you think of improving the visualization, making it clearer, more useful? Well, the context guides you, so many of you may have hazarded that this is encoding uncertainty information. The hurricane's precise path is not known. There's a likelihood it will be within this blob. Some common misinterpretations. The hurricane is getting bigger and bigger as it sweeps across the land, or the winds are getting more intense, or the winds will be most intense along the center line and kind of breezy at the edges of the cone. One attempt to counter these misinterpretations would be to show an ensemble of potential trajectories similar to C, thickly clustered in the middle and a few outliers veering off. It sounds sensible, but tests showed that this introduced a new misconception. Some users now thought that the hurricane would fragment and weaken, and diagram C actually is the next iteration, combining the cone of uncertainty with the ensemble of pathways. So, more generally, while there is evidence that visualizing uncertainty for decision-making can improve the quality of decisions, visualization impacts are context-sensitive and sometimes counterintuitive. So while there's some best practice to guide the creation of visualization formats, it's no substitute for audience testing, which, despite this fact, seems to be rarely done. And of course, when a visualization is dynamically generated and or interactive, then it's probably not possible to test it with every possible data set. The visual output of some novel data sets may therefore create problems for user interpretation that were not revealed by testing. Here's a rather extreme example of how eyes might play tricks on us. A and B are, believe it or not, the exact same shade. So what else might the user be bringing into the visualization? Well, for convenience, we could organize this on a spectrum, beginning on the left with the deep-seated quirks of perception, the visual illusions you can't unsee, to the vast taxonomy of cognitive biases and heuristics attested by behavioral economists, psychologists and social scientists, and presumed to be relatively stable across many cultures and time periods, and then to the structures studied by social scientists and humanities researchers, our social imaginary, the often unacknowledged presuppositions that shape what is thinkable, feelable, expressible, ideology, and then finally the more evanescent cultures of communities or institutions, or even just the habits of individuals. So with the proviso that there's no substitute for testing, here are some rules of thumb for creating visualizations. One is sometimes called expressiveness or data to ink ratio. Visuals should express all the intended relationships and nothing more. Avoid content-free decoration, says Edward Tufte. Then again, we do advise some caution. Maybe sometimes there is a role for some redundancy, and indeed Tufte's own elegant minimalist box chart format didn't really perform well when empirically tested. Maybe there's even sometimes role for decoration and playfulness. Research seems to indicate that it can be more memorable. Second, the principle of appropriate knowledge. The user of a visualization must have knowledge of the conventions necessary to extract its relevant information. And we saw earlier with the hurricane what a difference a key and some instructions made. But let's problematize this just a little bit. Words like appropriate, conventional, and relevant, they imply an element of value judgment. How much do we want users to perceive and respond just like we do? And how much do we want to create space for a variety of valid interpretations? Perhaps we want to tell the user what is the case, but not how to feel about it. But then if we exaggerate the variety of legitimate ways to feel about, let's say, 3 degrees warming, we may impair the audience's understanding of the concept of 3 degrees warming. One user exploring the IPCC Atlas's projected snow cover changes visualization fed back the visualizations did not feel meaningful, partly because there were no emotional cues. It did not offer a way to imagine the world that was implied. This is a common criticism of climate risk communication, that statistics calculated by climate models are hard to translate into the decision-relevant scenarios or to interpret emotionally. A third rule of thumb is the semantic principle. Make design choices which support correct interpretation even in the absence of appropriate knowledge. So sometimes this is described as making natural or common sense choices. A larger shape represents a greater magnitude. Higher numbers are higher on the axis. Blue to represent the sea, etc. Though of course not everything that one user feels as natural is felt as such by all users. In fact, we know that factors like the language a person speaks affect the semantics of color, for instance. And the hurricane example arguably aligns with the semantic principle, in that the larger the blob, the larger the uncertainty. But then again, the semantic principle might also support misreadings, like the larger the blob, the larger the affected area. So I suggest that the semantic principle is really telling us that the elements of a visualization carry meanings that are independent of the conventions associated with the visualization type, and independent of the conventions explicitly communicated to the user. You cannot simply wish these associations away, but you can try to embrace them to strengthen your visualization. The Innovative and Intriguing Cities of the Future project invites users to concretely imagine climate change in their home cities by making statistically robust analogies with other cities, but the names of cities overseas are very semantically rich. Telling me that in 2050 Birmingham is going to be more like Paris might not have exactly the right emotional effect. A general recommendation is to collaborate with professional designers and use a formal process like this one from the Visualising Uncertainty Toolkit. Note that the actual visual design starts quite late, after lots and lots of discussion of how to classify and quantify uncertainties. Remember that although iterative design processes include user feedback, a satisfied client who likes the visualization is not necessarily making competent decisions based on it. Ideally, there is testing of comprehension and or decision quality that does not rely on self-reporting. That said, some testing is better than none. I don't know exactly what kind of testing the IPCC did on this chart, which regionally visualizes observed changes in precipitation since the 1950s, as well as confidence in attribution, but I do wonder if more testing with users from Africa and South America might have led to different choices. Knowing that there is insufficient evidence about a region or that climate models make contradictory predictions can be valuable information. But since this aggregation and visualization methodology characterizes most of these territories as too uncertain to make predictions for, perhaps more visualization of the nuances of modeling would have been better than effectively leaving these regions looking blank. Another rule of thumb for visualization of uncertainty might be sometimes don't. Keep an open mind. Words may sometimes be your best option. As usual, I even want to problematize this simple principle. Even data presentations which we may not think of as visualizations have a visual dimension. For example, the layout, the choice of font, color scheme. This is from the AR6 summary for policymakers, and I wonder about the impact of putting 300 gigatons in the top right-hand corner of a table, and what we might learn from the research on central cascade gaze effect and bias towards the middle of arrays. Might a user even be tempted to draw an analogy between the corners, as though an 83% chance of limiting to 1.5 degrees was somehow just as extreme as a 17% chance of limiting to below 2.0. Again, a rationale for closer collaboration between climate science and the arts and humanities as well as other disciplines. So there's a summary of part 1, emphasizing data visualization of climate-related uncertainty for decision support, introducing and problematizing some rules of thumb, and reinforcing the desirability of working with an interdisciplinary team and testing on a case-by-case basis. But of course there is more to visualizing climate risk. In reality, one often can't assume a well-defined end user. You may be speaking into a void with hopes of finding an audience. Your intended audience may be uninterested, hostile, deceptive. You will operate under conditions of deep uncertainty and disinformation. So I'll just briefly mention some other types of visuals showing risks and impacts, like this imagined submerged New York of the future and this controversial skinny polar bear, showing activities consistent with mitigation and resilience, showing drivers of climate crisis. And these two are from the IPCC's own photo library, created with the help of the Climate Visuals Project, who offer these 7 principles for using photos in climate communication. Show real people, not staged photo ops. Tell new stories. Show climate causes at scale. Climate impacts are emotionally powerful. Understand your audience. Show local but serious climate impacts. Be very careful with protest imagery. Oversimplifying slightly for time's sake, they recommend more personal imagery with distinctive protagonists, with the partial exception of showing climate causes, where this might be seen as shaming individuals and letting institutions and systems off the hook. Here's some underlying research. Image of climate solutions produced positive emotional responses in the survey and were less polarizing for climate change skeptics, but they were also the least motivating of action. Images of impacts produce greater intentions towards personal behavioral change. So, what do you think? I've no specific reason to question any of this research. Speaking just personally, the IPCC photo library contains striking and intriguing imagery, a real step up from journalistic cliches. I'm still a little bit on the fence. As mentioned, visual elements carry a rich multiplicity of associations, and just because the communicator decides an association isn't relevant doesn't make it go away. A picture of people on a subway may be intended to show everyday low carbon behaviors, yet what some audience members may see is overcrowding and overpopulation, playing into a prevalent myth about the distribution of emissions. Pictures centering the global south and telling upbeat stories of welcome, but insofar as they represent global wealth inequality, do they risk normalizing this inequality and by extension normalizing the endurance of economic institutions and dynamics which are incompatible with rapid decarbonization? Well, how these images are used, of course, makes a huge difference. Kate Raworth's Donut of Planetary Boundaries and Social Boundaries is another intriguing, big-picture visualization of climate risks. Raworth also writes illuminatingly about visualization, climate economy in her book Donut Economics, but I've chosen this image really just to reinforce that point, that the meaning of any image is powerfully shaped by its social context, including the power, people, projects, and plans which mobilize that image. And here it's worth reflecting that currently even the best climate risk communication occurs against a background of cultural production which in many little ways undermines it. By portraying the economy, society, energy, housing, agriculture and climate as they are today, as though they will go on that way forever. Perhaps this ambient communication might be targeted with interventions, and this also reinforces the rationale for interdisciplinary collaboration between climate scientists, social scientists, and arts and humanities scholars. So, staying with that insight that communication always occurs in specific socio-political contexts, I would speculate that when we talk about communicating climate risk, we are not always, but often, really expressing frustrations about 2 things. First of all, power. Why hasn't climate science, including its uncertainties, exerted greater power to date in establishing a global fit-for-purpose framework of emissions reduction? And second, justice. In the many economic and social transformations which climate change demands, how to ensure that everyone gets a real say? We know these are important questions, and their answers can't exclusively be about understanding end-user needs or lucid textual and visual expression. So we've really zipped through visualizing climate uncertainty for decision support and using photography for climate storytelling. Some of this was based on our small toolkit, Visualizing Uncertainty, developed last year with an interdisciplinary team of experts. We're planning to build on this by co-creating a communicating climate risk toolkit to include Freya's goodie bag, case studies from this 3-day summit, and what we'd really love now is your input, brainstorming what other tools we might signpost or perhaps develop. What would help to communicate climate risks more effectively into society at all scales for decision support and for storytelling? What would help decision makers to better connect with science, to unblock obstacles, to rapidly and equitably delivering mitigation and resilience? And can communication be a jumping off point to thinking more broadly? What tools might help to energize climate science with more appropriate levels of impact compared with recent decades, in ways that acknowledge the reality of power discrepancies and embed a truly empowering and participatory ethos? And finally, what tools and resources already exist? What deserves to be known about more widely used? So please think ambitiously and think freely. Thank you.